Mate! I'd like to buy this, please.
$8 million, you mate.
What? That's so expensive.
Inflation.
What the bloody hell is that? Inflation, eh?
Inflation is an economic phenomena that refers to the general increase in the level of prices over time. In other words, inflation is when your purchasing power drops. This means that each dollar buys less. In Australia, this is measured by what we know as the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. This is a weighted basket of over 80,000 goods and services, which are then ranked according to their relevance to Australian households. We divide inflation into two main categories: headline and underlying inflation. Headline inflation is a common showcase of the general movements in the price of consumer goods and services, while underlying inflation removes volatile or temporary price fluctuations, and its aim is to reveal the underlying long-term inflation trends and therefore provide a more accurate representation of a household's cost of living. Generally, the Reserve Bank of Australia, or RBA, aims to keep inflation between 2 and 3% for optimal economic sustainability. Inflation is a very complicated issue because there are many causes and many types of it. An example of this is demand pull inflation, which occurs when consumer demand literally pulls prices up because it exceeds the economy's capacity to produce. This rise in prices can be demonstrated through an income to expenditure diagram, where an inflationary gap is created wherever aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply. On the other hand, when aggregate supply exceeds aggregate demand, a deflationary gap occurs. This type of inflation usually appears during economic booms, when consumers and businesses unleash spending, which we saw post-COVID with stimulus packages and ultra-low interest rates. Another cause of inflation is cost-push inflation, which occurs when the costs of the factors of production increase. That could be rising prices for fuel, higher wages, or disrupted supply chains. Firms naturally pass these costs onto the consumer in the form of higher prices, contributing to inflation. A clear example of cost-push inflation and another type of inflation is a global semiconductor chip shortage. Since 2022, the price of neon, which is central for chip making, rose by over 600% due to the Russia-Ukraine war, driving global PC component prices up by as much as 300%. For Australia, a country that imports most electronics, this translated directly into another type of inflation, which is imported inflation. Expectations can also fuel inflation. If people believe that prices will rise, they change their behavior. As mentioned earlier, the RBA's goal of keeping inflation between 2 and 3% means consumer expectations tend to be less volatile because of this measure. Right, look, while most people think of inflation as just this nasty effect that turns stores like Woolies into Louis Vuittons, at low and stable levels, it can actually boost economic growth. Mild inflation encourages spending by creating expectations of higher prices, therefore increasing aggregate demand and GDP. It also reduces decision-making distortions, which helps businesses and households plan their funds more effectively. However, when inflation spirals, the ripple effects can be very, very severe. Workers demand higher wages, firms raise prices or cut jobs, and a wage price spiral kicks in. Central banks naturally respond by hiking interest rates, tightening credit conditions, and also crushing investment. Uncertainty therefore rises. So no, inflation isn't just about your grocery bill going up. It's a systemic force that quietly chokes our confidence, erodes our stability, and punishes the economy as a whole. Alright, let's look at what's fueling inflation. both globally and here at home. Internationally, 3 major shocks have converged. First, COVID-19 lockdowns instigated historic disruptions to international division of labor as borders closed and labor shortages fractured global supply chains. At the same time, government stimulus packages and the RBA's historic 0.1% cash rate amplified aggregate demand while supply remained constrained. Border closures halted immigration and tightened labor markets, causing demand to outstrip supply and driving demand pull inflation. The resulting price pressures were amplified as energy and goods prices rose rapidly. Internal demand-side pressures were then compounded by the global supply shocks from the 2022 Russia-Ukraine war. Russia had been a major supplier of oil, gas, neon, and wheat. After the invasion, fuel prices rose by 30%, coal by 69%, and wheat by over 60%. As Australia imports most of its fuel, this led to significant imported inflation. Headline inflation peaked at 7.8% in the June quarter of 2022, which was driven largely by surging energy and food prices. However, since then, conditions have gradually improved. Central bank policy has tightened, energy prices have modulated, and global supply chains are stabilized. Now, domestically, Australia experienced a tight labour market after COVID-19 due to strict immigration laws and a lack of migrant workers. With labour supply being constrained, businesses naturally raised wages to attract staff. However, wages began rising faster than productivity, which increased unit labour costs significantly, and thus triggered cost-push inflation. Corporate behaviour has also driven inflation significantly. A government investigation found that Coles and Woolworths raised prices significantly beyond their input cost increases, which pointed to deliberate price gouging rather than simple supply chain pressure. This is exacerbated by an economic concept known as Keynesian price stickiness, where firms are hesitant to lower prices even after input costs fall. So while inflation is a global phenomenon, Australia's concentrated retail sector and structural features have magnified its effects. Let's break down how Australia's policymakers across fiscal, monetary, and microeconomic fronts have tried to maintain a control on inflation. Fiscal policy is what we call a counter-cyclical tool, with the government adjusting spending and taxation to regulate aggregate demand and maintain price stability. Some tools are automatic. The payee income tax system is one example. When income payments rise during an economic boom, so do tax collections, and income earners experience what is called the bracket creep phenomena. This lowers their disposable income and thus helps curb demand. Other tools are non-discretionary. The Home Builder Scheme, an expansionary fiscal policy between 2020 and 2021, injected $2.6 billion into the economy through housing grants to stimulate demand. While it supported economic activity, the Home Builder Scheme also contributed to demand pull inflation, driving the 7.8% surge in new dwelling costs as demand for construction materials outpaced the supply for them. Australia's stance on fiscal policy has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. During COVID, the government adopted a strongly expansionary approach. However, post-COVID, as inflation surged, fiscal policy naturally tightened. Now, with inflation moderating and growth slowing, the current stance is softening again, which is partly due to automatic stabilizers like increased welfare spending during economic slowdowns, and partly through targeted support like energy rebates. Now, let's talk monetary policy. Monetary policy is the RBA's main lever to control inflation. First, the RBA adjusts the cash rate. This change influences other interest rates throughout the economy via what's called the transmission mechanism. Those shifts then affect borrowing, asset prices, exchange rates, and consumer expectations. Finally, changes in spending impact inflation. During COVID, the RBA cut the cash rate to 0.1%, which heavily encouraged borrowing and spending through what is called the intertemporal substitution effect. This expansionary economic policy helped combat deflation from the pandemic, but ultimately, when compounded with fiscal stimulus and possibly a lack of foresight, drove inflation rates up much higher than what was expected. Post-COVID, inflation peaked at 7.8% in 2022. In response, the RBA implemented aggressive contractionary monetary policy, which lifted the cash rate to 4.35% in November of 2023. Due to this, and 13 consecutive interest rate hikes between May of 2022 and November of 2023, inflation has since fallen back within the target, sitting at approximately 2.4%. Now let's talk microeconomic reform, which tackles inflation from the structural supply-side issues of the economy. The 1983 Prices and Income Accord tied wage growth to productivity rather than inflation, replacing centralized awards with enterprise bargaining. This shift helped break the wage price spiral, with average inflation falling from 8.1% in the 1980s to just 2% in the 1990s, though productivity and economic growth still remained quite stagnant. The National Competition Policy of 1995 also ensures that local markets stay efficient, which prevents unjustified price rises. The ultimate goal of microeconomic reform is to stabilize prices alongside long-term and sustainable economic growth. If policymakers fail to act decisively, then the burden falls hardest onto ordinary people like us, workers facing real wage declines, households struggling with rising costs, and an economy left vulnerable to long-term instability.